Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Monday, December the 8th, and this morning, a clear message from the markets to Labour MPs: don't oust Keir Starmer. My name is Anne McElvoy from Politico.
And I'm Sam Coates of Sky News. Some of the biggest investment managers in the world really have gone today on the record in the Times to warn that ousting the Prime Minister would mean instability and the chance of a weaker pound and higher borrowing if that new government meant more spending. That's the challenge that MPs have to wrestle with at the end of this turbulent year.
Yes, big names like PGIM, the global asset management arm of Prudential Financial, which manages over $1.4 trillion in assets, has warned that any shift leftwards could mean markets might revisit concerns reminiscent of the Truss era. Meanwhile, Neuberger Berman, an investment management company, adds the current Prime Minister and Chancellor are known quantities.
That's the critical backdrop for all of these stories about leadership turmoil that you are seeing across the papers, you're hearing about here. It comes this morning as it emerged that Labour Together, the think tank that helped Keir Starmer to the leadership, is asking party members for candidates to replace him. I'm told that candidates to succeed Keir Starmer are holding discreet donor dinners. And in an Observer interview, Keir Starmer has suggested publicly that Angela Rayner will be back in the cabinet before long, barely 3 months after she left for an unpaid property tax bill. And Keir Starmer suggests criticism of her is sexism. One Labour source told me this was a sign Number 10 is worried about her doing a deal with Wes Streeting, so they're trying to get her back on side with Number 10. Everybody officially says that this is silly season talk, but it's just everywhere you go in Westminster.
The silly season seems to be with us perpetually, however, on that metric. More on all of this in just a moment from us. But to ensnare you that everything you need to know about the day ahead in British politics is here in a serious way too. President Zelenskyy will be meeting Keir Starmer in Downing Street later. The French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz will be joining in the discussions too in the early afternoon. Donald Trump, meanwhile, is expressing fresh frustration with Volodymyr Zelenskyy over the peace process and rather dumping on his leadership in separate comments.
I'm looking forward to Anne's take on that shortly as well. Meanwhile, the Telegraph revealed this morning that Nigel Farage has been reported to police by a whistleblower who claims that he breached electoral law over his local electoral expenses. A whistleblower called Richard Everett, who was a member of Farage's campaign team, claimed that thousands of pounds worth of spending in his Clacton constituency at the general election were not accounted for, and that this undeclared spending would have taken his election return over the legal spending limit. Now, of course, Reform completely denies this claim and point out that this is a disgruntled former councillor. It is interesting, however, that we have had the longest sustained personal series of attacks against Nigel Farage. So we'll see how that plays out in the coming days.
Indeed, and Kemi Badenoch hoping to hang on to her own momentum. Today she's unveiling her version of the grooming gangs inquiry, and it focuses very firmly on the religion and ethnicity of attackers. Tory leader has drawn up a proposed remit for the government's inquiry, which is yet to get properly underway. There's not even a chair appointed to that inquiry. The Prime Minister, we might remember, has performed a U-turn and agreed to an inquiry he initially didn't want to have, and the subject has brought him nothing but trouble. Well, the Tory leader now seeking to make her mark on that with a press conference this morning, and that theme of integration or lack of integration of communities that she's running hard on, Sam.
Let's start, though, properly and talk about where we think we are with Labour at the moment. We're 10 days on from the budget, and all across the papers there is sort of, I would call it low to medium level chuntering from people wanting to talk almost exclusively in private or background about what's going on inside the parties. We want this podcast to reflect the kind of what we actually know rather than just simply the gossip that's going around. So in terms of sort of factual anchors, what have we got, Anne?
Right. Facts first. Comment to follow. At the weekend, the Prime Minister told an interview in The Observer that he intends to defy his critics. He said 17 months into a 5-year Labour term, they say you're not able to change the country. Well, every time we've been in this position, we've defied them. That's what I intend to do, stirring stuff there from Starmer. And he quoted the philosophy of his mother to walk towards every challenge. She, of course, was severely disabled. Every time she was knocked down, she would get back up, however hard that was for her, even if it took her months to get back on her feet. She said, I am going to walk. I carry that inside me. So channeling a strong personal story there with a clear message, I think, to critics. I am not going to be knocked down. I get up again.
Absolutely. I am struck, though, reading that latest interview with Keir Starmer, that he is prepared to talk quite so explicitly and indulge interviewers quite so explicitly about his political travails. You know, one could even say that there's more than a touch of self-pity about his tone, which, by the way, is something that he's accused of in private when he talks to Labour MPs. It's often the Labour MPs tell me to say, oh, gosh, it really is hard for me, isn't it? Or words to that effect. So the interview starts on how he can't go for solo walks anymore, which is one of his favourite hobbies. He then goes on to say that young people are his moral mission, which is quite the change of gear from, say, the immigration heavy tone of the first half of the year. But I suppose one of the big things that struck me about this interview was something in its absence. The Prime Minister had a big platform here, and he didn't use it to say something big or new. And it doesn't have to be a policy announcement. It could just be a piece of rhetoric or outlining a particularly big fight beyond challenging the Greens and Reform UK quite a long way out from an election. He doesn't spoil for fights in the way that you often saw Tony Blair or David Cameron do. It turns into much more a sort of a back and forth about his motivations, which is the kind of interview that you could really have given at any time. But this is quite a critical time for him, I would argue.
Yeah, that's an interesting take there, Sam, from you. I suppose I read it as I could see a communications strategy here, regardless of whether we think it's likely to be successful or not, which is let's come back to the Keir Starmer that people elected as Prime Minister, and that sense of a lack of familiarity in the electorate, even after these 17 months that he refers to. Who is this person? What drives him? Now, where I think it's hard to connect it, as you point out, is to, well, what means more to him than something else? Is it young people? Is it immigration? Is it an opportunity gap? I mean, he would say it's all of these things, but you can't be everything to all people all of the time. But I think you do come back to something in Starmer that you either, if you're going to get on board with Starmer in Labour, have to accept that it's a fairly limited offer in terms of policy and change. As you say, it's nothing like we would have heard in that kind of interview from a Blair or a Cameron, but it is this is me. And some people will say it's self-indulgent, but he believes that he embodies the values of a moderate progressive Labour Party, and that's his strongest suit. The question is, what do others, including former backers, make of that? And there was an interesting straw in the wind that I'm sure you noticed too, that Labour Together, the campaign group once run by Morgan McSweeney, Starmer's rather embattled chief of staff, was this week asking activists for their views, not on Keir Starmer's values and how he's doing, but on contenders for a potential leadership challenge in a survey. Who did they think stood the best chance of leading Labour to electoral victory at the next general election? So you can feel that peeling away of some former groups around Starmer.
I mean, the idea that the Starmerite think tank is sending out a survey to Labour Party members asking who'd be best to succeed him. The really toxic question, actually, who would win an election, which invites the answer that not Keir Starmer, he's just was never not going to A, hit the headlines, and B, send a pretty sensational signal, I think. Now, Labour Together say that they're doing this merely because they want to set up an in-house polling ability to work out what Labour members think. That's what they told me overnight. So actually, the claim, which I'm struggling with, if I'm honest, is that this is a benchmarking exercise for statistical accuracy. But, you know, I think a lot of people would even be justified in asking, why are you setting up the ability to poll Labour members if it wasn't the fact that there were pretty big things on the horizon that you're worried about?
I'm just bookmarking that phrase, a benchmarking exercise for statistical accuracy. And the next time I'm accused of making trouble somewhere, I am so going to use it. But do go on, Sam.
Labour Together has been one of the best funded bits of the party, and until recently was run by Jonathan Ashworth, who of course was defeated in the general election last year before he headed off elsewhere. But one of the other really striking things, Anne, about the Times story, and forgive me, is the way it was written, because there is a complete absence of any names. It talks about Labour Together being Morgan McSweeney's former think tank, but as far as I could tell, it didn't name any of the individuals involved now in the think tank who have pressed the button on this quite big decision to do the polling. And when I went last night to research who the names were and just refresh my memory, I have to say I was quite surprised, right? There is a relatively new day-to-day head of Labour Together. She's the former Daily Mirror editor, Alison Phillips. There is also a chair of the organisation who found Alison Phillips recently. So Labour Together's chair is Sally Morgan, Baroness Morgan, right-hand person to Tony Blair when he was in government. And it also has, Labour Together also has an advisory council with names that absolutely pop off the page, including Alan Milburn, who is working with Wes Streeting in the health department and also conducting that critical review into welfare that the Prime Minister talked about a couple of weeks ago. These are some of the biggest names in Labour, and the organisation that they are attached to is sending out surveys to work out who would be best placed to win the next election if it's not Keir Starmer. That is a problem. All of these figures, obviously Alison Phillips, because she runs the organisation, but Sally Morgan, Alan Milburn, people like Rob Ford, I saw the name Anna Menand on there, as well as another member of the advisory council, and on, are now going to be asked, do you support this? Do you think that Keir Starmer isn't going to be the best choice for Labour at the next election? Why are you asking that question? All quite legitimately. And they're all going to be asked this, Anne. I think there's a big Labour Together bash this week, I think tomorrow. So that's all coming towards us very quickly. So did all these people know? I don't think the advisory council was consulted before they sent out this. Certainly one person said that they wasn't. They said it was a massive move and they didn't know and there hadn't been any meetings of it. But, you know, look at all the faces on the Labour Together website and ask them all, are these the people who in private are losing faith in Keir Starmer?
Wow, that's quite something. That's going to be an interesting Labour Together bash, as you point out. If there are different views between those very eminent, largely not all, but largely former Blairites, there feeling sort of in exile, like Russian aristocrats after the revolution. It's important on that score to watch the Tony Blair Institute too. He'll be speaking on Wednesday in conversation with Shabana Mahmood, the Home Secretary, at the pre-Christmas bash of his institute. Now, clearly, they're both on the right of the Labour Party. Both have been highlighting problems in the way that immigration and asylum have sapped faith in progressive causes. There were stories just a couple of days ago about the Blair Institute putting together an even more comprehensive policy plan for how to renew Britain, which some brand as his attempt to save the Labour Party, and some might see as a comeback moment, yet another one for the Prince across the water who never really goes away, TB.
Another comeback artist is the one that, you know, Downing Street are sort of bigging up effectively, and that is Angela Rayner. We mentioned the interview with the Prime Minister, Pat McFadden, also saying that Angela Rayner would be very welcome back in cabinet in the coming weeks. So everybody's sort of watching her the whole time to see what she does. She just hinted at a little bit of trouble around the employment rights bill. She wants to speed up the implementation of that. But you're also hearing whispers that she might get involved with some of the trouble around David Lammy and his proposals to withdraw juries from some types of criminal cases, Anne.
Yes, there's continuing criticism on the backbenchers and beyond, particularly in high-end legal circles, of the type that Keir Starmer used to move in, of David Lammy's plans to drastically curtail jury trials. One Labour MP opposing move, telling my Playbook colleagues this morning that up to 60 MPs might speak against this bid. And Angela Rayner, as you point out, has been making it known she has concerns about access to justice, some potentially unforeseen consequences of the changes that Lammy is proposing, and whether it will really help cut the court backlog in practice. There is a lot of sensitivity around the Justice Secretary framing his argument by citing the delay in rape cases coming to court. I touched on that in a column that I was writing yesterday. And that got quite, I think, a reactive response from the department. Now, David Lammy is keen to say that he believes up to 60% of cases are being withdrawn. That is from the moment when a complainant of rape comes forward, and that he says this is partly because of this gumming up of the system, that obviously these cases would be heard by a jury, but that the system is simply too clogged up, and that is putting a lot of people off coming forward in rape cases, and that some witnesses then fall away. But it is more a correlation than a fact, because you have to then say, well, was this cases where charges were being brought, or was it earlier on in the process? And you can go to and fro on that, but it's clearly causing quite a lot of consternation on the backbenches.
Let's watch Angela Rayner on that. That's absolutely fascinating. Okay, let's just handbrake turn briefly, because the big picture moment of the day will be when President Zelenskyy walks down Downing Street to see Keir Starmer. The question is whether or not this results in anything concrete. Russia was conducting massive attacks on Ukraine over the weekend. I suppose my big picture question, my big picture doubt about all of this, as Keir Starmer puts all his foreign policy eggs in this basket, is on the strategy that he's hoping to achieve. I read, and I'm going to quote Bloomberg here, Ukraine's European supporters have been hoping that if they can support Kyiv through the winter, Russia's economic struggles will intensify next year and Putin will lose his negotiating leverage. And as they all sit down, is that really the strategy? And isn't that just a little bit for the birds?
Yeah, I think the strategy is changing week to week. A straw in the wind I had was seeing one of the allies of Volodymyr Zelenskyy at the weekend. I was at a big event in Berlin, and this person very much in the forefront of trying to keep morale high in Ukraine. Klitschko, former boxing champion, erstwhile mayor of Kyiv, but making clear his concerns, think about where the war is now. So I think it feels like much more of a crunch point than just let's keep going through the winter and see if we can turn this around. Russia is clearly making gains, and they are concerning in terms of the military sphere. So we get this major sit down, and of course Starmer then gets to host Macron and Merz in London. And they'll be really, I think, watched very carefully to see how they respond, Sam, to what looks like a change of direction or hardening of direction, I should say, in Washington, because we're now just seeing pressure every time Donald Trump enters the fray. He uses it to dunk on Zelenskyy over his allegations that Zelenskyy is standing in the way of the US peace plan, and he gives more space to a deal with Vladimir Putin. I'm disappointed, he says, that Zelenskyy hasn't read my most recent proposal. Well, there's no evidence one way or the other for that. But, I think this is a darkening mood, and that will be what the leaders sitting down in Downing Street today need to take on board.
Well, let's see. It doesn't feel like there's a great deal of hope at the moment, but maybe Keir Starmer can help inject a bit of that. Okay, that was the alarm. We will see how they all get on today. We will be back tomorrow for Tuesday's Politics at Sam and Anne's. Have a great day, and we will see you then.
See you tomorrow morning.